For the first time in months, life was quiet. Too quiet. I leaned back on my porch, coffee in one hand, watching Rusty chase a butterfly like he didn't have a care in the world. The sun was shining, the breeze was just right, and my farm was exactly the way it should be, Nancy-free. After the whole HOA disaster, I expected some kind of retaliation, but weeks had passed, and nothing. No nasty letters. No HOA goons lurking at my fence. No cops knocking on my door with ridiculous complaints. It was almost unsettling. I should have been relieved, but I wasn't. Nancy Wilkins didn't just lose. She didn't just give up. That woman had the persistence of a mosquito in a dark room. Silent, annoying, and impossible to get rid of. And yet, ever since the court case blew up in her face, she had vanished. Where was she? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe she had finally learned her lesson. Maybe she moved to some other town where people hadn't seen her, get chased by my bulls on the internet. Maybe. I took another sip of coffee, staring out at my land, just to remind myself that I'd won. Nancy lost. The HOA was gone. I was free. But Rusty suddenly stopped chasing that butterfly, his ears perking up as he stared at the road leading to my property. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Something was coming. And just like that, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a snake coiled to strike. I hadn't even opened it yet, but something about the fancy gold lettering and expensive paper screamed trouble. Rusty sat beside me, tail still, ears flat. He didn't trust. It's either. I finally tore it open and pulled out a sleek professional letterhead from some corporate real estate firm I'd never heard of. Titan Land Acquisitions. Dear Mr. Benson, we are prepared to offer you triple the market value for Benson Acres. This is a limited-time offer with immediate payment and minimal legal hassle. Sincerely, Daniel Whitmore, Senior Acquisitions Manager. I blinked. Then I laughed, because it was so blatantly suspicious that I almost had to admire the effort. Triple the market value. No one throws that kind of money around unless they really, really want something. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the paper. If this was some random developer trying to gobble up farmland, they were out of luck. But my gut told me otherwise, and my gut was right. I made a few calls. Nothing fancy, just a couple of old friends in real estate who owed me favors. Within hours, I had my answer. Nancy Wilkins wasn't just behind this. She was working with a major investor, some rich out-of-town developer who saw my land as a prime location for his next project. I could almost hear her smug voice now. Can't. Beat him? Buy him out. She wanted my land. She wanted revenge. And I had a feeling this was just the opening move. I folded the letter and tossed it onto the counter. Rusty tilted his head, watching me like he was waiting for a command. I smirked. Looks. Like Nancy's backboy, Rusty let out a single bark, low and sharp. Yeah, I wasn't selling. Game on. I knew Nancy was vindictive. I knew she was persistent. But I had severely underestimated just how far she was willing to go. Because this time she wasn't just throwing around fake HOA notices or sending her goons with bolt cutters. This time she had the law on her side. I first caught wind of it when I stopped by Marty's Feed and Supply. Marty was the kind of guy who knew everything about everyone. Mostly because people couldn't resist spilling their secrets over a bag of horse feed. Jack, he said, rubbing his jaw like he was debating whether or not to say something. You hear about the zoning change? My stomach tightened. What zoning change? Marty sighed and slid a newspaper across the counter. I barely glanced at the front page before my eyes locked onto the headline. County approves new zoning district. Willow Creek expands HO jurisdiction. My heartbeat slowed. Then it sped up. I read the article, my eyes darting over words like reclassification, homeowner, inclusion, and, damn it, agricultural land reassessment. This wasn't just some bureaucratic nonsense. Nancy had bribed or sweet-talked the right people into redrawing district lines, so my farm, my damn privately owned land, was now legally part of her rotting corpse of an HOA. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth hurt. She found a loophole, a legal way to come after me. And the worst part? If this held up, she had every right to start enforcing her precious community guidelines. Meaning, my barn? An unauthorized structure? My cattle? A violation of noise ordinances. My entire way of life? An eyesore that needed to be corrected, and if I didn't comply, she could seize my damn land. A slow, burning anger built up inside me. This wasn't just a petty HOA feud anymore. Nancy had leveled up. She was playing dirty. But I wasn't about to roll over. I grabbed my phone and dialed Sheriff Daniels. "You see the news?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries, a long sigh on the other end. "Yeah, Jack, I saw it." And, Daniels said carefully, "legally speaking, if the county approved it, it's enforceable." I took a deep breath. "So you're telling me that after everything, after I proved they had no authority over me, Nancy just bought herself a new law?" "Looks that way," Daniels admitted. "Jack, you need a plan, and fast." I hung up without another word. Nancy thought she had me cornered. She thought paperwork and politics would do what her fake enforcers couldn't. But she forgot something. I don't lose. The first sign of trouble was the water. I went to fill Rusty's bowl one morning and noticed it looked off. Cloudy. A little too murky for well water. My gut told me to check the main line, and sure enough, somebody had tampered with it. Next, the power started flickering. Not just the usual old farm faulty wiring kind of flickering. Deliberate blackouts. The kind that happened just when I needed it most. During early morning chores, late night security checks. Then, the worst part. My cattle got sick. At first, it was just a few of them, lethargic, refusing to eat. But when one of my bulls collapsed in the pasture, my stomach dropped. I called the vet immediately. "This ain't natural, Jack," she said, kneeling beside the bull, running tests. "This looks like poisoning." I clenched my fists. "Poisoning?" She nodded grimly. "You need to find out who's messing with your farm." I already had a pretty good idea. Nancy. Or at the very least, whoever she was working with. This wasn't some paperwork battle anymore. This was sabotage. Someone wanted me off this land, and they weren't afraid to play dirty. I installed security cameras the very next day. Not just cheap ones either. Infrared, motion-activated, real-time alerts to my phone. If someone so much as breathed near my property, I'd know about it. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. 4:47 a.m. My phone buzzed. Motion detected. North fence. I jolted awake, heart pounding. I tapped into the live feed and saw two figures moving along my fence line, dressed in dark clothing, faces hidden. Definitely not your average trespassers. I grabbed my shotgun, threw on my boots, and headed out. By the time I reached the fence, the figures were moving fast, disappearing. Into the woods, I caught a glimpse of something metallic in one of their hands. Tools? A weapon? I couldn't tell. "Hey!" I barked, racking my shotgun. "You think I won't fire?" They didn't even hesitate, just vanished into the trees like ghosts. I stood there for a long moment, my breath visible in the cold air, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just some punk kids messing around. This was organized, planned, and worst of all, whoever they were, they weren't scared of me. I checked the footage the next morning. The men moved with precision, like they knew exactly where my cameras were. And then I saw it. One of them turned just for a split second, and under the shadow of his hood, I caught a glimpse of a logo on his jacket. Willow Creek Security, Nancy's new private security team. I gritted my teeth. She wasn't just playing dirty, she was playing for keeps. Fine. She wanted a war? She was about to get one. Nancy thought she had me cornered. She poisoned my cattle, cut my power, sent her goons onto my land in the dead of night. But if she thought I was going to roll over and let her take my farm, she was dead wrong. It was time to hit back. The next morning I drove straight to Hank Calloway's office. Hank wasn't just a lawyer. He was an old friend, the kind of guy who knew the legal system inside and out. More importantly, he hated corrupt bureaucrats almost as much as I did. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through the county records I'd handed him, chewing on the end of a cigar that wasn't even lit. After a few minutes, he chuckled. "Oh, Nancy, you really thought you were slick, didn't you?" he muttered, shaking his head. I crossed my arms. "What'd you find?" "She had the zoning laws changed, yeah," he said, tapping the paper. "But here's the thing. They rushed it. Paperwork like this? It takes months to push through properly, and this was stamped and approved in less than 2 weeks." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning somebody pulled strings. And if we can prove that, bribes, backdoor deals, anything shady, this whole thing gets tossed out." My stomach tightened. "And how do we prove it?" Hank grinned. "We set a trap." That night, I made a few calls. A friend at the county records office, a guy who owed me a favor at the sheriff's department, and a reporter looking for a big break. Then, I sent Nancy an email. Subject: land sale negotiation. "Nancy, I've reconsidered your offer. If your investor is still interested, I'm willing to discuss terms. Let's meet." Jack, I stared at the screen for a long second before hitting send. Rusty, curled up by my feet, let out a low huff, like even he didn't trust the move. "Don't worry, boy," I muttered, scratching his head. "I ain't selling." I was setting the bait, and now we waited. Nancy responded immediately. She was thrilled, probably thought she'd finally beaten me. She set up a meeting at a fancy steakhouse on the edge of town. I walked in wearing my best dirty boots. Nancy was already there, sitting with 2 men in suits. One was Daniel Whitmore, the real estate guy who sent me that letter. The other, a politician I recognized from the news, County Commissioner Greg Dawson. Bingo. I slid into the booth across from them, keeping my face neutral. Nancy smiled like a snake who just smelled blood. "Jack," she purred. "So glad you came to your senses." I leaned back, arms crossed. "Let's talk terms." Daniel straightened his tie. "We're prepared to offer you 4 times the market value. Cash. No legal delays. But we need you to sign immediately." I forced a smirk. "And let me guess. If I don't sign, you'll keep making my life hell." Nancy took a slow sip of wine. "Oh, Jack, you always assume the worst about me." Dawson cleared his throat. "This is just business. A fair deal." "Uh-huh," I said, glancing at my watch. Funny, because last I checked, using political favors to force someone into a sale is illegal. Nancy's smile froze. Whitmore's face twitched. Dawson paled. And that's when Hank walked in. He wasn't alone. A reporter, a county investigator, and one of Sheriff Daniels' deputies, recording everything. Nancy's wineglass shattered as it slipped from her hand. Game. Over. Nancy Wilkins was finished. Or at least, that's what I thought. The night after I trapped her in that steakhouse meeting, the audio recordings of her backroom deals hit the internet like wildfire. Hank made sure they landed in the hands of every news station, legal office, and community forum within 100 miles. Within hours, the fallout began. HOA president caught in corruption scandal. County commissioner tied to shady land deal. Local farmer outsmarts HOA in legal showdown. The comments were brutal. People called for Nancy to resign, be investigated, be thrown in jail. And I sat back on my porch, sipped my coffee, and watched the chaos unfold. For the first time in weeks, I let myself believe it was over. Rusty lay by my feet, tail thumping lazily against the wood. "We did it, boy," I muttered, scratching his ears. "We actually won." I should have known better, because Nancy Wilkins wasn't just a sore loser. She was a cornered animal. And when an animal's cornered, it doesn't just back down, it bites. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. Sirens. I stepped outside to find 3 black SUVs rolling up my driveway. Not the sheriff's department. No, these were federal vehicles. Rusty stood up, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I frowned. What the hell was this? A man in a crisp suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. His expression was the kind of government official blank that told me I wasn't gonna like what he had to say. "Mr. Benson, he said smoothly, flipping through his papers. I'm Agent Reynolds, EPA Compliance Division. EPA? Environmental Protection Agency? You mind telling me what this is about? I asked, arms crossed. Reynolds gave a practiced sigh, like he had already dealt with people like me before. We've received multiple reports that your property poses a significant risk to public health and environmental safety. Contaminated water sources, unregulated livestock conditions, improper waste disposal. I actually laughed. A sharp, humorless thing. Let me guess, the complaints came from a certain Nancy Wilkins? Reynolds didn't blink. We don't disclose the identities of complainants. Yeah? Sure. And let me guess again, I said, stepping closer. You're here to what? Find me? Shut me down? Reynolds held out a document, an official-looking letter with a big, ugly government stamp on the top. Eviction notice, he said flatly. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Everything in me went still. 48 hours. To leave my own damn land. I clenched my fists. On what grounds? The ongoing environmental investigation, Reynolds replied, still emotionless. Until it's resolved, the land will be considered unfit for agricultural use. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. Nancy couldn't beat me legally, so she had gone federal. She had pulled every last string she had left and weaponized the government against me. And for the first time in this whole damn war, I didn't know if I could win. Nancy wanted a war. Well, she damn sure had one now, because if she thought I was just going to pack up and leave, she had another thing coming. The moment the feds left, I hit the phones. I called everyone. Farmers, business owners, ranchers, neighbors. Within hours, word had spread across town like wildfire. People showed up in droves. Old-timers who'd been farming this land longer than I'd been alive. Families who hated the HOA's years of bullying. Even former HOA members who despised Nancy but had been too afraid to stand up before. And Sheriff Daniels? He showed up too. Not in uniform, not with his deputies, as my friend. You know this is political nonsense, he muttered, arms crossed, and I can't legally interfere with federal agents. I don't need you to interfere, I said. I just need you to witness what happens next. Daniels exhaled sharply, then nodded. You got it. By the next morning, the news crews had arrived. Hundreds of people stood outside my farm, holding signs, banners, and cameras. Local reporters covered it first. Then bigger outlets picked up the story. By noon, it was national news. Farmer faces eviction over questionable land deal. Small town rallies against corrupt HOA. Government overreach or corporate greed. Nancy must have been watching from her mansion, seething, because suddenly the EPA agents rolled back in. Only. This time, they weren't so sure of themselves. Agent Reynolds stepped out of his SUV, clearly irritated. The cameras swarmed him. Mr. Benson, he said, voice tight, continuing to occupy this land is a direct violation of federal orders. I crossed my arms. You sure about that? He frowned. Excuse me? I turned to Hank, who grinned like a shark and held up his phone. I'd like to introduce you to an old friend of mine, Hank said. Federal Judge Malcolm Rayner. Reynolds stiffened. So did Nancy's investor Daniel Whitmore, who had just arrived to watch my eviction. You see, Hank continued, we did a little digging. He handed Reynolds a legal document. The EPA orders you're enforcing? Yeah, those were pushed through, under false pretenses. The zoning changes? Illegal. And your eviction notice? Hank smirked. Void. The crowd exploded. Reynolds's face went pale. He looked at Whitmore, but the investor was already backing away, because just then, another SUV pulled up and outstepped the real federal agents. Greg Dawson? One of them called out. The county commissioner? The one Nancy bribed? The man froze. You're under arrest for fraud, bribery, and abuse of power. Nancy, standing in the distance, visibly swayed on her feet. Whitmore turned to run, but two agents stopped him cold, and just like that, the entire scam came crashing down. Nancy's empire? Gone? Her allies? Handcuffed? And me? I was still standing. Nancy. Wilkins was done. Her corrupt land deal? Destroyed. Her political allies? Arrested. Her reputation? torpedoed in front of the entire country. It should have been over. But then, something strange happened. The very next morning, news broke. Whitmore's investment firm had been bought out, not by another developer, not by the county, but by a private investor. The land deal, the same one Nancy had bet everything on, was now in the hands of a single person. And that person? They had one condition. Nancy Wilkins had to leave town. I damn near spit out my coffee when I read that. I had no idea who this investor was, but whoever they were, they hated Nancy just as much as I did. I finally got my answer later that week. Black car pulled up to my farm. Out stepped a man in his 70s, dressed sharp like old money. I recognized him instantly, Elliot Grayson, a name I hadn't heard in years. He was an old landowner, one of the first people Nancy's HOA had ever run out of town. And now he was back. "You really gave her hell, Benson," Elliot said, smiling. "Figured I'd return the favor." "You bought the land deal?" I asked. He nodded, and shut it down, permanently. I let out a low whistle. "Why?" Elliot shrugged. "Call it revenge. Call it unfinished business. Either way, Nancy's finished. She won't be coming back from this one." I smirked. "You sure about that?" Elliot chuckled. "Let's just say I made her an offer she couldn't refuse." A week later, the town threw a massive celebration. Nancy was gone. The HOA? Dead. And me? I was still standing. To mark the occasion, I gave my biggest bull a new name. Nancy. It felt poetic. Life was finally back to normal. Or so I thought. Because one night, just as I was closing up the barn, Rusty started barking at the gate. I walked over, expecting nothing. Instead, I found an envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just my name written in perfect black ink. I tore it open, heart pounding. Inside was a single piece of paper. 5 words. "This isn't over, Jack Benson." I stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, I smiled. Bring it on. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.